In this how-to guide, I'm going to show you how to stitch the Forget-Me-Nots kit. Now here's everything that's included in your kit. First up, you have the fabric, which has been screen printed with a permanent ink. And attached to that are two needles, a large and a small one, which I'll come on to later. You've got an embroidery hoop, as well as a hoop guide showing how to use it. You've got all your threads on numbered bobbins, each one wound on there and matching the plan. The stitch plan shows you which stitch to do where and which colour goes where. And whilst this is quite self-explanatory, it's useful to refer to. On the back, there's some good photos of the finished piece, so you can easily refer to them to see what it's meant to look like. And then you have your big stitch book. And this stitch book introduces you to loads of different stitches, but it has the methods written out for each individual one. So you can take your chain stitch page from your stitch plan and find the instructions in the larger stitch book. And all of this helps you stitch this finished piece. In this kit, we're using a satin stitch, chain stitch, and French knots. So you would take your stitch plan, and we can see the plan here shows this area is stitched in the dark green colour 1 in a chain stitch. That's how they all match together. Now let's get stuck in. First, I'm going to take out my embroidery hoop, loosen it up a bit, and I'm going to start showing you how to stitch on this top left flower. So place your hoop over the top and make sure the hoop is tense. You want your fabric to be as taut as possible. Now, as I said, there's two needles, a large and a small. There's a smaller one because you'll find that the small one is much easier to use for French knots. But for all the rest of the stitching, we're using a large needle. I'm going to pick up my colour number 2, which is my blue bobbin, and we're going to start first stitching the petals. So cut yourself around about an arm's length of thread. And then for this kit, we split down the strands. So we're going to stitch everything with 3 strands of thread. So you can see here, I'm splitting out the thread, pulling out 3 strands. Always pull these individually rather than trying to do them together, as you'll get yourself in a knot if you do that. Then I'm going to thread up my needle, and I use the large needle, which makes it really easy to thread the needle. I'm tying a knot in the end of the thread. And you can do a knot-free method if you're a particularly sort of perfectionist stitcher, but I just use knots. Now take your remaining 3 strands and wind them back on the bobbin. You'll want to use those later, so this is just good practice to keep everything organised. So I'm going to begin, and I'm stitching my petals here in a satin stitch. So I'm working horizontally across the petals rather than vertically. And with a satin stitch, it's always best to stitch in the narrower direction possible. And whilst it would be quicker to stitch vertically, it will look much neater to go horizontally. So all you do with your satin stitch is you work from one side to the other, left to right, filling in the area. You can tell you're doing your satin stitch right because you'll have exactly the same amount of stitching on the front as the back, and I'll come on and show you that later. But here you can see all I'm doing is I'm filling out the entire shape of the flower. And once I've finished, I just tidy up any areas that I think would benefit from an extra stitch, or maybe I've left a little gap. I'm stitching till I've got about 5 centimetres of thread left on the needle, and then I'm going to finish it off. Don't try to go any further than this, as you'll end up accidentally unthreading your needle. And so there you go, you can see on the back how I've got the same stitching on the back as the front. To secure my thread, all I'm doing is I'm running it underneath the stitches a few times, getting it nice and secure, and then I'm going to trim off any excess. And so you're going to continue with that, filling in all the flower heads, all the petals, until every single one is filled in. And you don't have to do it in the order of all the blue at once, but I recommend doing all the petals of a flower first, and then moving on to the next bit. So now I'm going to show you the chain stitch stems that we're using throughout. So this time I'm going back to my stitch plan, and I'm going to be using the dark green, colour number 1. And you can see that here, chain stitch, doing all the petals, and it's a colour number 1 I'm using. So I'm going to do exactly the same process as before. I'm going to cut an arm's length of thread, separate down the strands, and then I'm going to thread my needle up I'll then wind the remaining back onto the bobbin to use later. Got a knot tied, and here we go. So for the chain stitch here, I'm using the link method. Now I do have a separate video showing this in more detail if you want that, but you can see what happens here. I first create a short little securing stitch, and then I bring my needle up a few millimeters away, pass the needle underneath the stitch, and then go back down through the same hole. So I'm going to show you again. I pull my needle up, pass it underneath the previous stitch, and go back down through the same hole. And I'm just going to repeat that process the whole way down the stem. And that starts creating my chain stitch. Now, when I get to the bottom, I'm going to want to add in my next part, and this is where I'm going to use the existing stitches as my securing stitch. So you can see that here. Rather than creating a small little securing stitch, I'm just passing the needle underneath the chain of chain stitch. Once I've got my first one going in that direction, I carry on. So I bring my needle up, pass it under those, and down. Now, if you want a simpler process, you can just also use satin stitch for all this filling area. Chain stitch is a lovely stitch and has a lovely effect, but if you feel more comfortable working in satin stitch, you can do that also. So all I'm doing is now just filling in as much of that area as I can using my chain stitch. And I'm going to go round and do exactly the same on the leaves. And so all the greenery throughout the design is all done in my chain stitch. And again, once I've finished, I'm going to turn the piece over and I secure my thread on the back just by running the thread under a few of the strands, and then I trim off any excess. So you keep going. You can see how the leaves are made up of various rows of chain stitch side by side, and it's as simple as that. So the next step is our French knots. And again, I'm cutting the same length of thread and I'm splitting it down, and I'm going to work with 3 strands. But this time, all importantly, I'm using my small needle. And this is because it's much easier to create a neat French knot if you use the small needle. So I do have a separate video on French knots, which can be really worth watching when you practice these. But I'm going to show you this process a few times, just so you can get to grips with it. Basically, I bring my needle up, and then using my left hand, I wrap the thread around the tip of the needle a few times, and then I pass the needle back through, maintaining good tension in my thread using my left hand. Now let me show you that closer too. So I bring my needle up, wrap around a few times, needle goes back down into the fabric, and I hold the thread tense in my left hand, and then I pull tight. Now I'm going to keep going and just fill in this area, and because they're all close together, you don't need to worry about how neat each individual one is. And then all we do is exactly the same, secure the thread on the back. Now this is a really good exercise to improve your French knots because it's quite a safe environment to do them in, as they don't really need to be too neat. And all I do is I go around and put the French knots in the centre of every single flower. So the finishing touch is now stitching the name. Now you'll notice the hoop is smaller than the fabric, and so all I need to do is move my hoop across a little bit. I'm going to take my strands that I'd already wound onto the bobbin from before, those 3 strands, and thread my needle back up again, and this time I'm back with my big needle again. I'm stitching the name in a back stitch, and back stitch is just a way of stitching these straight lines and not getting any gaps between the stitches. So I bring my needle up away from where the last stitch came up. See here, bringing it up away, and then I work backwards into the same hole. That's why it's called a back stitch. So I kind of go 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I'm going to continue that process, stitching all round the name of the flower. And that's it. That's the last step you'll need in stitching your forget-me-nots. Now do take a look at all the how-to mounting videos for this embroidery kit, as that will show you how to mount up your finished piece. And head over to the website if you want to see our framing options, because we have loads of different ways that you can frame up your pieces. I really hope you enjoy stitching this kit.